We are very pleased to have you with us today for our Better Information session. Good to have you back if you've been before, and welcome if you've come for the first time. I'm Lynn Holtane. I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Law Foundation, and this is a series that we take very seriously, and we hope that you get as much out of it as I know we will today. Peter Davies is your presenter, and you're well aware of that. He is a very fine friend of the Foundation. And we have been involved very closely in very recent days with the production of our annual report. Peter knows his way around annual reports and reports in general intimately, given that he works currently at Vargo, which, as many of you would be aware, produces more reports than most of us have hot dinners. So he's a man who is very well versed in the construction of complex, difficult documents and how images make a difference. So that's the undertaking for today, is to allow pictures to speak many thousands of words and how to make the most of them. Peter is expert in this field and has extensive experience in and around government. I'll leave you in his very capable hands. Have a lovely morning, and thanks again. See you soon. Thank you. Over to you.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for coming along today. The focus of the session is going to be on images and storytelling. But I preface the session by saying I'm not a graphic designer. My background is in editing and publishing. But a couple of my early roles were quite production heavy, which meant that I guess I got to expand my skills into the more hands-on side of the publishing industry, trying out, I guess, different techniques for how layouts might support key messages, how you might incorporate images into the text, all of those sorts of things to try and further the message that you want to spread and make sure that you, I guess, can illustrate it in a way that's going to make sense and is going to engage your audience. So that's the sort of starting point for today's session. The things we're going to cover, let's get this started. We're going to look at some tips for selecting compelling images and ask some questions about what kind of things make an image compelling, what kind of composition might make one thing more appealing than another. We're also going to look at some sources of free and low-cost images, because I think one of the particular challenges working, say, not-for-profit organisations or the community sector is that often there are not huge budgets available for sourcing images and design and those sorts of things. So we're going to look at some options that might help you to develop and source some good images. We're going to talk about the technical aspects of using images in publications, because some of the most complex aspects are colour profiles, resolution, file formats, all of those sorts of things that can seem a little bit impenetrable if you don't have someone to lead you through it. So I'll try and give you a quick guide to some of those aspects. Towards the end of the session, we're going to have a look at infographics, because I've noticed increasingly publications, whether in print or online, are turning their attention towards ways to visualise data or present information in different ways so that you don't end up with big slabs of text. So we'll have a bit of a chat about some tools for developing infographics, and we'll look at some case studies of infographics and how you might be able to put something like that together. Towards the end, we'll look at some other useful tools, and there'll be some case studies along the way as well to try and illustrate the examples. So that's what we're going to cover. Before we start, though, I'm really keen to get a bit of a sense of what kinds of publications in print, online, what kinds of communication tools you guys are using or producing. What kind of things are you facing? What are the challenges in incorporating images into your work? Does anyone have any suggestions for me, any starting points?
My name is Peter. I'm afraid and I've got a project with Defence, multinational, and security. So I've got to put tanks and rifles and airplanes.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've got to grab the attention and read what I said, which is 10, 20 pages a day.
Yep, yep,
So
for
that's
sure.
it.
Quite a challenge. And I imagine finding, the specific model or like really relevant photos is probably the challenge there. There'd be a million and one photos of tanks, but is it a tank that's relevant to the story that you're writing about? Any other sorts of publications that you are working on? Yeah.
Some easy read publications for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and local legal communities.
Great.
Well, I'm from the Office of the Public Advocate, and we produce a range of publications, but our biggest one is Take Control, which is a self-help kit for people making injury and power of attorney, advanced care directives,
Yeah.
wanting medical treatment, decision making. So it's the information and forms in the one booklet. It's
Yeah,
quite
for sure.
challenging.
Yeah. And I think sometimes illustrating those things that can perhaps feel a little bit grim at the outset, it's a real challenge to get that tone right, where it's not doom and gloom, but at the same time maybe has a bit of colour to it. So I worked, one of the publications that I worked on with the Foundation last year was a publication about wills, and getting that tone right in the images was a real challenge, I think. So, yeah.
I work at Dispute Settlement Centre, so probably the stuff we can be published more online, so we'll be refreshing our website. It's always hard to find a good image that represents us because it's easy to show disputes, hard to show settlement, hard to show the two combined. You either have people in a meeting or which doesn't look like anything, or you have people arguing, which kind of puts the negative connotation on it. The other thing that I do is we do workshops. We like to promote those. So there's always a challenge of taking an image that represents the good work that happens in that workshop without showing a bunch of heads, backs of people's heads.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, the composition of those kind of action shots is quite difficult to get right, I think. Yeah.
We're from the Mental Health Tribunal, so we're designing a new website. So we need some images and to produce some videos to try to help people understand the tribunal and to encourage more people to attend.
Yeah, great. Okay, excellent.
It's a challenge because tribunal hearings aren't visually splendid because they're in like big meeting rooms in hospital.
Okay.
And you can't show with patients because, privacy reasons.
I guess I'm hoping perhaps some of the sort of infographic or abstract kind of stuff might be a way to build some kind of visual identity around that, but without having to show actual people doing actual things, maybe. Maybe there's some other techniques that you could use. Okay, we might get started then. So, the main question as a starting point for our conversation is what makes a compelling image? In this section, I'm going to talk a bit about some different sorts of composition techniques, sorts of content in photos that might make one thing more appealing than another. So, some of you may be familiar with the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a pretty well-worn trope about how to compose images to make them as appealing as possible. And the theory is that if you divide an image in thirds, it gives you the ideal focus points within the image. So what you would ideally have is a focus point at any of those intersections of the grid. It's a pretty reliable technique. You'll find that often the viewfinder on your camera, or I think on your phone as well, you can turn on the grid. So it'll help you compose photos in this way if you like the idea of it. By way of some examples, here are 3 of different orientations, and you'll notice that they all have that point of focus at one of those points on the grid. You can see there, through cropping you can actually adjust that a little bit. The photo of the woman on the far side there, it's actually quite a wide photo. So when we trialled that one as a cover for the publication, that Wills that I mentioned earlier, and we tried moving her around based on where we wanted to have the text overlaying that photo. We ended up not choosing that one, but we liked the simplicity of it and the kind of graphic quality of it, and the fact that it did, I guess it had that, tonally it kind of struck that question about navigating something without looking super joyous about it, but at the same time not looking super depressed about it. So, that's how the rule of thirds works. Is that something that you have encountered before? Doesn't have any experience using that? Give it a try. It's not super difficult to implement. We'll talk a bit later on about how cropping can support this kind of message as well, so that you can crop in a way to get that focus point at the right point of the frame.
So it's kind of the opposite of just centering the subject.
Yeah. And I mean, centering a subject can work really well in some instances, particularly if you've got something very symmetrical. You'll often find there's some really great photos of, say, staircases or arches or any of those kind of forms that really lend themselves to a very flat, symmetrical kind of layout. Where you have something that doesn't necessarily conform in that way, often the rule of thirds can be a good sort of alternative to that approach. And it often creates a bit more dynamism within the frame as well. If you're looking at covers, the rule of thirds can be very useful because it usually gives you some space available for a title, a subtitle, whatever else you might want to overlay on the image. And even within a publication, I mean, if you've got some kind of a pull quote or a key fact or something you want to pull out, often this technique gives you some room to move. If you want to put a circle over something or lay some text over an image, this is a good way to accommodate that as well. Okay, we might move on. The next technique for compelling images that I wanted to talk about was movement. And this is the idea that an image that has some sort of sense of movement within it is usually much more interesting than a really static, flat image. And that can often be through people moving through space. It can also be through, I guess, the sense that there is space within the image for people to move into. So if we look at that county court one there, the people are quite blurry and not particularly distinct, but you get the sense that they're coming towards you. You get the sense that they're moving down those stairs, and that often creates a more dynamic image. This one here, I mean, you'll see on any of the stock photo sites that we look at, there are often photos of Parliament House and the steps of Parliament House, and often there's very grand photos of a building. And the building is magnificent, no doubt, and it can be framed very well with the beautiful columns out the front, and the steps are really graphic as well. But a photo like this, where you get people moving through that space, often has a kind of warmth and humanity to it. And that can often be, I guess, a more dynamic solution to a standard flat photo. With the image on the far right there, that one is from a publication about bike laws, which the Victoria Law Foundation produced a couple of years ago now. I like that image because, it was about making sure the cars leave enough space for cyclists and bike lanes, things like that. But I like that image had the sense of the riders coming towards you. There was a sort of a real movement in that photo that you didn't get from, say, an overhead photo of the markings of a bike lane, which has a different sort of purpose. Like that has a more informational, instructive kind of approach, whereas this one's probably a bit more evocative and gives you a sense of a scene, something happening. So that's movement. Related to that is this idea of depth and perspective. So often the most compelling images are the one where you get something in the foreground, something in the background, and some sort of sense of space between them. So this one here is another one from that bike law publication. And what I really liked about it is that you get that line of cyclists moving down the bike lane and presumably heading up the hill. You get the line of traffic moving as well. You get the trams in the distance and a bit of cityscape as well. So there's a lot of elements in this photo, but it doesn't feel overwhelming because it is spread over some sort of depth. There's a sense of perspective in the photo. Similarly, this one here of the Legislative Assembly. That one has an interesting perspective because it's up high, and often photos in Parliament are not taken from that perspective. So you do get a sense of the range of people within the chamber doing their thing. You get the sense of the people up in the gallery there at the top. The columns are quite graphic as an inclusion in that photo, and you get that kind of curve and swoop of the seats around the edge of the photo there. So that one, I guess the perspective in that is that overhead that gives you a kind of bird's eye view of something unfolding. And the final one there of Parliament House, I guess the depth is brought to life by the angles and lines in that photo. So you have that long sort of retaining wall type thing on the side there. You get the graphic quality of the building itself in the background, and then you have the flag flying at the top there, which also has a sense of movement in it. It's a bit hard to tell at this scale, but and that one pretty closely conforms to that rule of thirds as well. You've got the flag at the top there. This one of the bike law, you've got the cyclist down in the bottom corner there. So that rule of thirds, you'll notice, does keep coming up in the photos that have a sense of perspective in them as well. Are there any questions about that before we move on? Okay, these are some other examples of depth and perspective, and these ones take a different approach in that the depth and the perspective is about, I guess, a more graphic composition rather than something really literal. So the one of the bikes there, you get that repeating pattern of the Melbourne bike lines. So that image is probably not going to tell you a heap of information about how the bike scheme works or anything like that. But as a graphic photo, it's a really great way to, I guess, capture the sense of those bikes in ranks around the city. And because of the depth of the photo, going back along the line of bikes, you do get a sense of depth and a sense of perspective, which is a bit more interesting perhaps than one of those bikes on its own sitting on a footpath. The other one there is from a publication about neighbourhood laws, and that one accompanied the opening section that was about the point that people have to work with their neighbours because we all have neighbours. And I like that this showed those kind of rows of houses that kind of, day to day you might not see your neighbours, you might not really look at their houses, but then you see that there are rows and rows of them surrounding you. I thought that one had quite a graphic quality, and once again that aerial perspective gives it a kind of dynamism that you might not get from the front of a kind of suburban house or something like that. Next up I wanted to talk about engagement, and this one I guess in a way might seem like kind of an obvious sort of thing, but people like looking at photos of people, and photos of people making eye contact, or not even just people, I mean it might be animals as well, helps to create a sense of connection, and it creates a sense of warmth, and it can really liven up a publication. When we were talking earlier, we talked about some of the challenges of finding photos of people in particular instances where you might need to protect their privacy or protect their confidentiality. In those sorts of instances, these may not be an option, but if you do have the option of including people, it can be a really great way to liven up a publication and to create some sort of human connection as well. Taking photos like this, and photos of this sort of quality, can be quite challenging sometimes, unless you have some sort of photographic experience, but the latest generation of smartphones can do some amazing portrait photography, and often they have a dedicated mode for that sort of thing, which has that effect of blurring out the background and really bringing the person in the photo into focus. And I think that can be a really great way to assemble some photos that have that warmth and human connection about them. Had some other examples as well. So these ones are different from that previous set in that people are not looking at the camera, but you get a sense of the engagement with another person. So this one here was from the cover of a publication about neighbourhood laws. And I like that one because you got this sense of people talking to each other, connecting with each other. There's a warmth about it that you probably wouldn't get from just a photo of the outside of a house or from a fence or any of those other things that you might by default turn to when you think about neighbourhood laws. The middle one there is definitely stock photo, but I felt like it didn't look too cheesy. To me, it didn't have that real sense of, here's American office worker having meeting and shaking hands. It felt a bit more like regular people having a conversation with someone. And the final one there was another example of neighbourhood engagement. That one was for a full page in a DL publication. So you can imagine they're quite narrow pages and quite tall pages. And one of the real challenges with that format is getting something that will crop adequately into that space. And this one here, it's probably a little bit tight, but it worked in that space. I mean, if you had a little bit of extra width, it'd probably be a slightly nicer composition. But I thought as an example of what you can do in even a narrow space, it showed a good example of people engaging and creating a bit of warmth in that way. I've touched on this a couple of times so far, this idea of cropping. And often, I guess, by default, if you insert a photo in a Word document or into your CMS for your website, it puts the whole image in, and unless you really think about it, that's how you proceed. But spending a bit of time looking at how you might make the most of an image can really enhance an average image and make it into something a bit more special. These are all, I guess, different in their technique, but what unites them is that they're quite tight crops in on the subject. Particularly this one here. I mean, you really don't get a lot of the parents at all, but I feel like as a story, that tells you something very particular. That one was to illustrate text about preparing your will and thinking about your children's future and writing your will. The middle one there is the Supreme Court. And often, I mean, I guess as with Parliament, there are many, many photos of the outside of the Supreme Court. And often they are those sort of majestic architectural type photos. What I liked about this one is that it has quite a unique perspective, from low looking up high. There's an Australian flag draped there next to the tree. You get the beautiful clouds in the sky. There's something quite interesting about that photo that you might not normally get from the outside of a building. The third photo there is from the publications about bike law. And that photo was quite a bit wider, but once again we were working with the DL format, so we looked at how we might be able to crop that photo to make it, I guess, really sing in a narrow space, and we were fortunate that it worked quite well. What you don't get is the whole bike, and at the time we toyed with whether that was an issue or not. You know, do you need to see the whole bike to really get that story? But I think with that tight crop, you get enough of it. You get a sense of her preparing for her ride, and the text that accompanied that was, I think it was 10 tips for getting on your bike, and it was things like, you know, having a bike lock with you, having your lights, having your brightly coloured clothing. So that photo illustrated a lot of the things that were in the accompanying text. The one in the top corner there is from a publication about the Supreme Court, and that's the section about being in the audience in court, sitting in the gallery. And the text that accompanied that was about appropriate behaviour, so what things you should wear, you know, being respectful, those sorts of things. And once again, it was quite a long photo, but we cropped it in a bit tighter so that you got a real sense of the different sorts of people that might go to a courtroom. And that one was, I guess, in a way about showing that kind of human side, so it wasn't just that aerial shot of a courtroom with the backs of people's heads. We wanted to show a bit more of a, I guess, an intimate sense of that experience.
Did you have to get permission from those people?
So that one was from, yeah, so that one was from, I think it was a court open day, and the people had signed waivers when they went in. But, yeah, there are certainly some complexities around that. I think during Law Week, there's often a court open day and those sorts of things, and often there's a photographer's hand for that. But yeah, there are certainly some permissions that you would need to seek to have photos of people in that sense. Most of these stock photo sites will have any of those conditions laid out, and most of the time there's waivers applied so that you, as the user, are not required to hunt down the people. And,
No, if she took it, you'd have to seek it.
Oh, definitely, yeah, for sure. And the last one there is from that publication about wills. So that one was just a tight crop to, I guess, illustrate something in a fairly sort of abstract way around that process of signing wills and making sure all of that information is documented. Yeah, cropping is a really powerful tool, and I would say it's probably one of the things that we hopefully be most useful out of today's session. Depending on what kind of tools you're working with, say in Microsoft Word, there is a cropping tool in there, so when you paste in a photo on the design toolbar or something like that, it will let you crop the photo. It doesn't crop it permanently, which is quite handy if you decide that you don't like what you've done with it, but it will allow you to drag in the edges and try different sorts of compositions, and then you can drag the edges back out again if you decide that it's not exactly what you wanted. Yeah, even without standard photo editing software, you can still do quite a lot of powerful editing of your images. I thought we might have a look at some further examples of image choices and how you might crop them into something slightly more interesting. So the publication that you can see just down there on the corner of the cabinet is Victoria's legal system. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's kind of an overview of the legal sector and how laws are made in Australia. That's the second edition of the publication. The first half of it looks at the lawmaking process, and the second half of it has short pieces of text, I think it's about 150 to 200 words, on a whole range of different agencies who contribute to Victoria's legal sector. For the section on Victoria Legal Aid, we received 2 photo options, and these were the 2 options available. we were working within, that one's A5 publication, so we had to look at a way to make either one of these photos work within that format. The first one we looked at was this one here. We thought there was that sense of engagement in that photo. We liked the fact that you could see the man in the audience talking to the instructor. It had some great colourful backgrounds there. To me, it had a lot of potential as an image. And we looked at how we might crop that to make it fit in the publication. So for the A5 format, we wanted to make sure that the instructor was in there because she, is kind of the VLA part of that photo. Otherwise, it's just a group of people sitting in a row. So with that crop, you end up with this kind of photo. I feel like it probably reduces the value of the photo. It's not a great crop because the audience looks quite passive and they're the faces that you can see, and you get quite a lot of the back of the instructor. So the end result was probably a little bit underwhelming from what initially is quite a good photo. Had we been working in a different format, for example, somewhere where we didn't need a really wide photo, we could have done something like that, which works quite well because you do get the sense of the group of people and the instructor. You still get the colourful backgrounds. That works quite well, but it wasn't going to be right in the format that we were working with. So we had a look at the other photo available, which is this one. And in that format, you'll notice that there's quite a lot of blank space. There's the big white wall behind the presenters. You get a lot of the upper wall near the ceiling. And really, in that kind of format, it's not quite so compelling an image. But if you look at different ways we might crop it, so this was, I think this was one we ended up with in the publication itself. So you get the instructor, you get that great movement through her hand gestures, you get a sense of the audience, but the back of the heads is not dominating the photo too much. Had we been looking at a different format, we also had this option, which was to crop out a lot of that ceiling space and a bit of the white wall down the side. So you do get a really good sense of collaboration and engagement there as well. But for the publication we were working with, this format worked for us. Do you have any thoughts on that? What are your reflections on it? Yeah.
It gives the impression they are migrants trying to learn English.
I give that impression, or the photo does?
Photo.
I
think nothing to do with legal.
I'm not sure what the context for the photo was.
But that's what it says.
Yeah, sure, okay.
It makes me think if you're running education classes, have a member of staff take photos while you're doing it around the front so you capture it better.
Yeah.
So you're not left with great big wide spaces.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we talked before
you can see
about...
that girl's asking in the pink top.
Yes.
But you can't see because of the ponytail. So if you had someone just to the right taking that photo, it would have been great. Better photo.
Yeah. One of my previous jobs was working at Melbourne Grammar School in their communications team. And I had not done any photography before, but it was quite a big part of that job was to try and get around and photograph different sorts of school events happening. And that was often in classroom contexts. And trying to get a good photo where you get a sense of the audience, but a sense of the speaker speaking in some kind of dynamic way without their mouth in an awkward pose or their eyes closed or something like that, was often quite a challenge. And I think if you find that you're in a situation where you're taking photos of events or photos for your own use, a great idea is to move around a bit so that you do get a range of different photos, because subtle things like that, the difference of whether you can see the speaker or not makes a big difference. And if you've got photos from a few different angles, you just give yourself those sorts of options to work from. So, yeah.
I was just saying, the other advantage of that shot is it's relatively non-identifying of
Yep.
the participants.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
that were inspiration.
Yeah,
With
yeah.
the exception of the
Yes, yep. And that... and that can certainly be an issue with photos of groups of people doing things, from two reasons. Partly because there might be privacy considerations, and second to that is also that it dates the photo. Because if you've got something, it's a photo of an event with a kind of, say it's a staff photo or something like that. Once those people leave, that photo loses a lot of its currency. So there can certainly be advantages to getting those photos that are relatively anonymous of the audience, where there's only one sort of identifiable person or a couple of identifiable people. It allows you to manage those sorts of issues a bit more easily as well. Okay, here are some other examples. So this is a publication I worked on for the Victorian Auditor General's Office, and they produce an annual plan each year. The annual plan outlines the types of audits they intend to do over the course of the year. Excuse me. The content, as you can imagine, can be quite dry, and it can also be really varied because they're short sections about a whole range of different audit topics that they're undertaking. So it's very difficult to find one photo that captures all of those things. Faced with that challenge, we went in a different direction. Rather than trying to capture everything in one photo, we just thought we'd capture one sort of abstract representative kind of thing. So what we looked at were these full-page section openers that showed something about Victoria being the scope of the Auditor General's audits. So the first one here is a Melbourne cityscape. You can see you get that sense of movement, people moving across the tram tracks. The photo itself is reasonably symmetrical in that you get those the two long lines of the tram tracks, giving you a bit of depth and perspective. You get the shrine in the background there. There's a tram coming towards you. Even though it's a bit of a wet, gloomy day, I think the photo is quite compelling because it feels like a very Melbourne experience. For better or for worse. The next one there is a cityscape. What I liked about that one was that you got a sense of the greenery of the city, the greenery that surrounds the city, and you also get a sense of, I guess, the modernity of the buildings behind. It conforms to that rule of thirds approach in that you do get the focus on the buildings in the back corner there. It gave, because we needed to overlay it with a title, that image worked well because it gave us that blank patch of grass in the corner there where we could put that section title. And also has a nice kind of sunny perspective that was a good offset to the feeling of the first photo. The third one there is some kind of shipping scene. It's down at the docks and it's cars being unloaded from a big shipping tankery kind of thing. Forgive my technical knowledge. It's a little bit hard to tell on the projector, but the image has a beautiful symmetry about it where the water in front of it is quite still and you get this very, very clear reflection of the tanker and the crane and the stuff being unloaded reflected in the image. For something that, based on the image caption on the search page was not super interesting, I thought as an image it actually had a really graphic quality to it, which worked quite well. And as a set, I thought the three images showed quite different things. There was a few more sections within that publication. There was one that showed a regional courthouse. I'm trying to think what the other ones were. We tried to show a range of different perspectives from around Victoria to give a sense of the Auditor General's audit scope. Yeah.
Were these photographs commissioned for purpose, or were they broader than that? And will you speak to briefs?
Sorry?
Briefs, photography briefs?
I won't be talking about that today. These ones came from a website called Shutterstock that you may be familiar with. Shutterstock isn't free, but to purchase individual images is usually not too prohibitive, depending on your budget. And one good thing about that site is that it has quite a lot of local content. So, and the other good thing is that you can search by photographer. So if you find a photographer who has taken one good photo of something local, you can click on their whole portfolio and you'll find that they often have a heap of photos from around town. So to give it that kind of local flavour, that one's quite a good website. But it isn't a free service. So, but I won't be speaking so much about photography. The next case study I wanted to look at was to do with, harmonious images and images that kind of contribute to a story, but in a kind of muted way. So the Law Help Guide is a publication that the Victoria Law Foundation has produced over a number of years. I think the first one might have been maybe 2009 or something like that. And it gets an annual update each year. The point of it is to address the issue that there's not really a central contact point to know how to seek legal help if you need it. The cover of the publication has remained the same throughout its life because it gets an annual update, so the date changes, but the image and the format of the publication has stayed the same during that time. And we wanted to do that to maintain the brand of it, so that it was this thing that had I guess a bit more of a presence and was a bit more familiar. The content year on year got some minor tweaks around contact details, but the message was largely the same. It wasn't a publication that changed dramatically each year. When we did redesign the inside of it, we wanted to have some photos in there. There wasn't a heap of room to move. That's the, if you can imagine, it's a DL publication. So that's the inside kind of spread of the publication. So we wanted to find some images that would be kind of harmonious with the orange and the kind of muted tone of the front cover. That has a kind of a misty sort of background. It looks like, you know, directional signs taken on a misty morning. So when we were looking for these two photos, we were looking at something that would pick up on the tones of that front cover, as well as having content that was kind of relevant. So the lady at the top there, looking, I guess, slightly questioning. I'm trying to remember what search terms we used to find her. It was something like pensive or questioning or one of those sorts of terms. But we felt like tonally, she didn't look super distressed, but she wasn't, you know, happy, smiling, having a great time. We thought that it was about the right kind of tone through her facial expression. And then for the man on the phone, we wanted something that, I guess, had that sort of generic, possibly local flavour to it. We didn't want it to look like one of those really standard stock photos of, you know, distressed teen, that sort of thing. So that's how we came to select those photos. We were also conscious of, I guess, not because there is so much text in the publication, not overwhelming the publication with the images. And one of the great things about some of the search engines, I think these ones might have come from Shutterstock as well, was that you can search by colour palette as well. So you can tell it what kind of, you can ask for a particular orientation. So if you want it to fit, deliver to you portrait photos or landscape photos, you can ask it to do that. You can also set the kind of colour palette you want it to work with. So these sorts of things helped us to settle on those photos so that we have a kind of harmonious feel about it.
Can I ask what does DL mean?
Sorry. DL is where you have an A4 piece of paper and you fold it in thirds. So it's that kind of upright.
Trifold. Got you.
Yeah. So kind of like a envelope sort of size. Yep. There we go. There's an example at the back there. Okay. We have, we're nearly at the break, but we might do a quick activity as a lead into that. What I have here is some examples of photos shamelessly ripped off from online. My methodology was to search for Australian websites and use particular search terms that I thought might be broadly relevant to the group we've got here today. So there's some photos from local government, there's some photos from courts and justice, there's some photos from community justice, and there's some photos from community legal centres. Perhaps in groups of 3 or 4, I'll get you to come and collect one of these, and then I want you to have a look at them and just do some analysis on what you like, what you don't like, what you think works from a content sense, what you think works from a composition sense, and then we'll just have a quick discussion around your findings afterwards. So, thank you. Okay, we might get started for part 2. The next thing I was going to talk about was some free and low-cost stock image sources. Once you start investigating, you'll find that they vary in the range of things they have. Some of them have a really big collection, but a lot of it's quite corporate-looking or quite American-focused. So you'll need to do a little bit of investigating to find the thing that has the best kind of mix for you, but they all have different sorts of strengths about them. And the good news is that most of them do not require any kind of attribution, which is very handy. I think I've broken this. Okay, so the first two I wanted to mention were Unsplash and Pixabay. They're both really easy to use, and they both have a really good range of high quality photos. For Unsplash, you'll find that it probably has a bit more of the sort of local content than Pixabay, but they both, I think, have quite good selections. On Pixabay, you'll find some quite good kind of atmospheric or textural kind of abstract type things. So if you're doing a publication where you need some backgrounds that you're going to overlay with text or something like that, or backgrounds to a website, Pixabay might have some good options for you. I'd also mention that Pixabay is, I think, supported by or sponsored by Adobe Stock, which is the stock photo site linked to the Adobe Creative Suite. So that's Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. And so if you, I think if you create an account with Pixabay, you get 30 days free on Adobe Stock or something like that. They have a deal at the moment. So if you are about to source photos for a project and you know what you're looking for, you might be able to take advantage of that and download all at once or something like that. Two more that I was going to mention were Realistic Shots and ISO Republic. Realistic Shots probably doesn't have as big a range as the two earlier ones I mentioned, but what they do have is photos that look quite everyday. They're nice photos, but they also don't have that kind of glossy sheen that you might find on a lot of other photo sites, which I think for the kind of community information type publications is often a good way to go because they don't feel too stock-like. ISO Republic has good quality photos. Once again, some of them, I guess, do have a bit of that kind of corporate look, but they also have some really good ones on there that show those more sorts of generic types of experiences that you might need to capture in your publications. And I noticed when I was looking at ISO Republic that they are also promoting free stock video. I didn't really explore that beyond looking at the thing, but if any of you do video stuff, I gather that might have some kind of general kind of generic stock backgrounds and information that you might be able to use. So something to explore if you do have to do much video work day to day. Two further ones that you might find interesting are Design Rush and Death to Stock. Design Rush is a site that has a lot of information for creative agencies, but they also have a public domain archive. And they add new photos to it each week.
That says free for personal, so that means you'd have to get, you might have to pay, because if it says free for personal, we're not personal.
Yeah, you may, and it's probably actually a really good prompt to check the permissions on all of them. Most of them have, no attribution required or things like that, but you want to check the actual requirements for individual photos because they may not all be the same. The stock photo sites have a license with the photographer, but depending on the profile of that photographer, there may be different requirements around them. So make sure that you do read the fine print carefully. On something like Shutterstock or Getty Images, which are some of the bigger photo sites, they have different attribution requirements based on the photographer, and they will generally tell you, if there is attribution, how you should do that attribution. Often on those paid sites as well, the license will change based on what you want to do with the photo. So if you're using the photo at a small size on the inside page of a publication with limited distribution, you'll pay far less than if you want to use that photo as a full cover on a publication with much wider distribution. And there are similar kinds of variations in the requirements around where you have to credit people too. Death to Stock is a paid site, but it's not hugely expensive. I think it's $12 a month, I think. and it brands itself as the stock photo site if you don't want stock photos. So they have some really nice quality images. A lot of them have quite an editorial feel for them, which, depending on the type of publication you're producing, may not be exactly what you need if you want something that's a bit more real. But they have some really lovely things. Two last ones I was going to mention were Flickr Commons and Wikimedia Commons. I don't know if any of you have come across a Creative Commons license. So both of these sites are kind of built on that foundation where they offer a range of photos that are in the public realm. Some of the Wikimedia Commons ones usually do require attribution. What's great about Wikimedia Commons is that it's all the photos off Wikipedia, and it means that you can often find photos of very specific things that you would struggle to find through a regular stock photo or search engine. They also offer you different sizes usually. So the image that you see when you search Wikipedia is usually quite small, but through Wikimedia Commons you can often access the photo at a much larger size or a higher quality, which is useful if you're producing print publications because you want to get the highest quality possible. Flickr Commons works in a sort of similar way. It's a public domain archive, and they have heaps of photos on there. Once again, you'll need to check the specific attribution requirements because it will vary based on who owns the photo. As an aside, when in some of my earlier work with the Law Foundation, we sourced photos directly from Flickr occasionally, and that process was kind of unofficial. We would find a photo we liked and contact the photographer and say, would you mind licensing this to us? So generally they were just regular people posting photos that they had taken, and they were often very pleased to see their photo have another life somewhere else. So if you find something, often it's very easy to contact other users on those sites, and you may then be able to take advantage of great photos they've taken. Particularly if you have a really limited budget, that can often be a good way to go about it, because for a layperson, having their photo in a publication with their name underneath it is often a bit of a bonus. So I think don't be afraid to have conversations with people if you find an image that you want to use. People are often very willing to negotiate with you about that, particularly as not-for-profits, where they can see some sort of public good in the work you're doing. Leading on from that, I'm not going to talk much about the big paid stock photo sites, but most of them will offer not-for-profit pricing, and that it's often not very well documented on their site, but if you explain what you're using the image for, they'll often be able to come back to you with a much better price than what you'll get through the standard pricing model advertised on their site. And it's worth pursuing that because sometimes it'll make that perfect, great image that you want for your cover accessible, where before it probably wasn't, because the prices on those sites can sometimes be prohibitive. So, worth investigating. Before we move on, did anyone have any questions about any of those? No? I wanted to talk briefly about retouching tools. Because, Photoshop is the gold standard, but it's quite complex to use, and the license can be quite expensive, so often organisations won't necessarily have access to that. But there are a couple of good apps that can do a lot of the stuff that Photoshop can do for you in terms of photo retouching. So two apps I use on my phone are VSCO and Snapseed. They're both really easy to use, and they're fantastic. They have a range of kind of custom settings where you can change the exposure and brightness on photos, the saturation, all of those sorts of minor adjustments you might make. But most of them also have a kind of auto touch-up, and I don't know what wizardry it is, but it makes the photos look great. So that's something worth exploring. They're both really easy to use, and if you take photos on your phone, you can open them straight in the app and do a little bit of retouching and they're kind of ready to go. They also offer you cropping as well. If you have a photo but you want to change the composition of a little bit, they'll allow you to crop out the boring ceiling or the bits of carpet that you don't want to see.
Are they iPhone or Android?
I have used them on an iPhone, but they might also be Android. I'm not sure.
Okay.
The other one I mentioned is GIMP, which is a website where you can do basically anything that Photoshop can do, it can do as well. It's a bit more complex to use, and depending on the complexity of what you're doing, you might find that the two mobile apps actually suffice. But if you're working on a desktop, you might want to explore GIMP. It has some amazing capability. Talking about retouching and the kind of treatments you might apply to images, I wanted to present this little case study, which is from this publication, Victoria's Legal System. In that publication, there are two broad sections. So there's one that looks at laws in Victoria, and there's one that looks at the legal sector in Victoria. And we wanted to do a kind of section opener for each of those. We started off trying to, with colour photos, but for some, so that the one on the Supreme Court was fine. That one was adequate for that size. It was still going to reproduce okay. For some reason, this photo of the Constitution, we could find the black and white version at a suitable scale, but the colour version was only available at a much smaller size. I'm not sure how it happened. I don't know where the full colour went, but it just wasn't available anywhere. So we went with the black and white, which meant by necessity changing the Supreme Court onto black and white as well. But we didn't want them to feel, I guess it felt quite heavy just as a plain black and white image when the rest of the publication was in colour. So we applied this colour tint to kind of unite the two openers and also to give them, I guess, a kind of abstract feel, but at the same time let the two of them work together. If you have images that you think don't have great coloration, or they're maybe a little bit dark or a bit drab, sometimes making them black and white and then applying some kind of tint over them can make them work a bit better. It's that kind of technique is a bit more forgiving perhaps than a full colour image that doesn't reproduce very well. It's also a good way to unite a set of images if you've got multiple things you need to combine, where some are really bright and light and sunny or really high quality and other ones feel a bit more homemade. Sometimes a technique like this can give very disparate images a similar kind of feel and make them work better as a set. So something to keep in mind if you are trying to, I guess, have a composition of different images that have very different qualities and colours about them.
Do you do that in your retouching out, the colour filter? Or is there something else you use for that?
So for that one, I did that in InDesign, but most of the layout programs will be able to do that, and I think the latest version of Microsoft Word can do that as well. It has some photo filters that it can apply to your images.
Great, thanks.
I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about some technical aspects of images, because I know that can be a bit daunting if you're not really familiar with the technology behind it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is resolution. Are you all familiar with dots per inch? So dots per inch is the, I guess, the standard measure of image quality. And for print publications, you would usually aim to have an image at 300 dots per inch. But that can be quite complex because when you request the image at 300 dots per inch and the image arrives, it's 300 dots per inch at 5 centimetres by 5 centimetres, and then when you blow it up to half a page, it's no longer 300 dpi, now it's 72 dpi or 100 dpi or something much lower, which won't reproduce very well. I think the easiest way to think about it is maybe, say, stockings. So when they're not stretched out, you have your limited number of threads and lines, and then when you stretch them, the gaps become bigger and you can see a lot more of the texture of the stockings. Does that make sense? So think about images in the same way. They have a set number of dots, as per this example, and when you blow it up, the dots become more visible. So if we consider this 100%, once you've increased it to 200%, you've reduced the number of dots that fit within 1 inch. And that's why an image that starts off at 300 dpi becomes a lower dpi once you've made the image bigger. Does that make sense?
The
Yeah.
different images you've taken then from an iPhone, what are they in the quality range? Even though I know there's different versions of iPhone.
Yeah. Generally, the photos are really good. Like, they will take a photo of 300 dpi. I think they're about maybe 15 or 20 centimetres, so they're quite big. When you send an image from your phone, like if you need to send it to yourself, it will usually ask you what size you want to send. So it will ask you small, medium, large, original, something like that. Always pick the largest one, because then you'll just have the most room to play with, really.
So just sorry, could you say that again?
About iPhones?
No,
Or-
about which one you select?
So I think the last one is actual size, and it's usually much bigger than any of the scaled options that it gives you.
What that was.
Yeah, so if you take that, I mean, I've noticed on my phone it tells you the file size, like kilobyte wise, next to it, and you'll notice that the small and medium ones are a couple of hundred kilobytes, which is very small in terms of images, and the actual size might be a couple of megabytes, which is getting closer to what you would want for something printable.
And if you use it on sharing media like Facebook or something like that, does that shrink it down?
It does shrink it down, yep. I think if I'm thinking about, say, Twitter, even though it gives you a small preview, you can, when you click on it, how it fills the screen. So I think it must shrink it somewhat, but not too far, really. Yeah, it depends a bit what you're using it for as well. Sorry, question back?
If you're using iPhone images on a website, don't you have to publish something like that now because it's less than the website?
Yep.
So what's your recommendation?
Sure. So there are two main resolutions that you would work to. So for printed publications, you want 300 dots per inch. For websites, it's usually 72. Sometimes you'll see 96. You probably don't want to go below 72 because you'll start to notice quite a lot of degradation in the image itself. But all of it is kind of prefaced on how big the image is. So, that trend with websites to have the big kind of banner image that stretches all the way across and resizes based on whether you're on a wide screen or not. Those images are often thousands of pixels wide. So there's a few different kind of numbers that come into effect. Basically, you want the whatever number of pixels you want it to be. So say it's 1,000 pixels wide. You want it to be 72 dpi at 1,000 pixels. So you need to combine the resolution with the size you want it to be.
Do you mind explaining the difference between a DPI and a pixel? Really quick.
I think, I'm not an expert, I think they are just to do with difference to mediums. So the dots in dots per inch is about how the number of dots that the printer puts on a page. Pixels are the units on a screen. So you'll hear people talk about dots per inch for images used on screen. But pixels is kind of the measure of the number of their squares, I think.
Sometimes people talk about it as being pixelated, which
Yep.
you get that distortion.
Yep. So that's when an image has been stretched too far, and suddenly you can see the dots, because even though they started off at this size, once you've stretched them, they become quite visible. So you can see the individual units that make up the photo.
In terms of the image size too, generally, if you're actually giving them to a designer, always give high resolution so that when they can.
And I don't know what
High res is like the full.
and is that related to the DPI?
Yeah.
What usually is high res?
So 300 is usually high res.
And that would print any size, even the size of a bus.
No, absolutely not.
What's through?
Okay, so an image has a fixed size. So say we've got an image that's 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, and it's 300 dpi at that size. So that's the original image. If you were reproducing that photo in a magazine or in a book, you'd only want to produce it at a maximum of 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres. Because beyond that, you're going to start to see the pixels because you're stretching it beyond that. And the more you stretch it, the lower your DPI goes.
So only at a double it, is that what you're saying?
No, don't stretch it beyond. Well, depending on if you're using it, let's talk about print. If you're using it in print, don't stretch it beyond its maximum size at 300 dpi.
Okay, right.
Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
If you're using it on a website, you have a bit more leeway because you don't need to keep that 300, you need to keep 72 DPI. So I'm not great at maths, but an image that is 300 DPI at 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, at 72 DPI it'll be much bigger, it'll be kind of 3 times that size. So you've then got a much larger image you can work with on screen. But you can't print, if you try and print it at that size, you'll find that it doesn't look great.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yep.
Sorry, it's quite technical and yeah.
Just in terms of, so I've got an image, say I don't really get what DPI means, etc.
Yep.
How do I test it? How do I know it's at 72 or 300? What do I do? What will I do? Is there an easy way to do that?
I mean, I have usually used Photoshop if I've ever needed to confirm that. Sometimes you can tell by the number of, I mean, you can't tell exactly, but if you've got a file that's multiple megabytes, it's usually a reasonably high-res photo. I mean, the photos they use in magazines for a full page might be 60 or 70 megabytes, but a photo for a regular kind of printer, yeah, anything above, say, 3 or 4 megabytes will probably be okay. There can be a little bit of guesswork if you're not using actual software to check that. One of the quirks of Microsoft Word is that it reduces the pixels when you put the images into the file unless you tell it not to, and that lives within the preferences of your particular version of Microsoft Word. So if you're getting something printed professionally, like on an actual offset printer, you probably want to check what Word is doing to your photos, if you're working in Word, because it will reduce the quality when you insert them unless you tell it to maintain the quality of those images. And that is often not visible on screen, and it's often not visible on things printed out of a general office printer, but it can become quite apparent when you print it on a printing press. If you are getting something printed, I'd usually recommend sending even a draft of your file, probably as a PDF, to the printer you want to work with and get them to check that it's going to print okay. There is a very nifty tool in Adobe Acrobat Pro, so not Reader but the version up from that, that will scan all the images and let you know if any of them are not going to print okay. And your printer will certainly have access to that. So it is difficult to check the technical specs, without access to those bits of software though. Yeah.
Do you have DPI? Do you have the metric system equivalent?
Yes, there is dots per centimetre, but the numbers aren't quite as simple. So it's something like 236 dots per inch and
Per centimetre.
Per centimetre, sorry.
Yes.
There is an equivalent, but the industry standard is dots per inch. How did I go? Do you have any more questions about that? Okay. If you want to have a chat about it afterwards, I'm happy to have another go at trying to explain it in a slightly less technical manner. I thought it would be worth talking about file formats as well, because that's often a question that comes up and often affects the quality and flexibility of the files you're working with. When we're talking about images, there are 2 main types. So there are vector files and there are raster files. Which you might imagine has some, fun connotation, but it doesn't. So the essential difference is that vector files are made up of lines and raster files are made up of dots. So someone asked about blowing a photo up to the size of a bus. Yes. If you want to do that, if you're doing a banner or a billboard or something like that, you want to be working with vector files because the way they work is it's lines based on mathematical algorithms and they're kind of infinitely scalable. So if you've got a logo, for example, you probably want it in a vector or raster format because it will mean that you can blow it up to the size of a banner, you can put it on letterhead, and it will stay crisp and sharp the whole time. If you tried to do the same thing with a raster file, you'd find that it got more and more pixelated until it was just kind of a blur of very obvious dots. Different software programs deal with different sorts of image formats. So where we talk about vector files, we're talking usually about logos and line art. So things that are made up of discrete lines or blocks of colour. Where we talk about raster files, we're usually talking about photos and hand-drawn illustrations, those sorts of things. And you'll notice that they have different sorts of file extensions. So if you are dealing with logos and line art, the best formats are EPS and PDF. And EPS is an encapsulated PostScript file. If you don't have any kind of, I guess, professional type software, you might never ever encounter an EPS. It's the kind of thing that graphic designers work with to try and get the best quality out of logos. Architects use them a lot for floor plans of buildings because they give you a lot of flexibility where you can adjust the weight of individual lines, you can change the curve of lines. They give you a lot of micro control over the very fine details. A PDF can also contain an EPS type file, a vector type file. So you know when you open a PDF how sometimes you can select the text and copy it out? That's because it's a vector file and it contains live lines that allow you to extract that text. If you tried the same thing in a JPEG, you wouldn't be able to extract the text because it's flattened, and that text, instead of being a series of lines, is now a series of dots, and they're flat, and you can't extract them in the same way. The good points about vector files, or their strengths, are that they can handle transparency. So say you've got a full-page image on the cover of your publication, and you want to have your logo floating in the top right-hand corner. A vector file will allow you to pop that straight in and it'll just float over the top. They're infinitely scalable, and they usually have smallish file sizes. Because they're based on mathematical calculations, the actual file itself is quite small, but they can just be scaled infinitely. For raster files, JPEG and TIFF are two popular image formats, but they can't handle transparency. So if you have something transparent in a photo, it'll come out as white. If you do need to include something something transparent, a PNG will allow you to do that. So where I talked about designers preferring an EPS of your logo, for day-to-day use, you know, if you're just doing internal documents or something like that, you might find that a PNG is easier to work with because it'll work on the standard Office operating system, but it will have a transparent background if you want it to. So that can be a handy substitute if you don't have the high-tech professional software that usually deals with EPS files. One of the limitations of raster files is they have a fixed size. So where these can scale infinitely, you'll notice that the quality of raster files starts to reduce once you get to a certain point. In terms of the actual file size itself, kilobytes and megabytes, they vary quite a bit. A JPEG is usually quite small. TIFFs are generally quite large, and PNGs I think sit somewhere in the middle. But it will vary a lot depending on the physical proportions of the image in that file. Yeah. Questions about that? Yep.
BMPs, bitmaps.
Yep. A BMP.
Now they're on this file.
Yeah, I mean, BMPs are raster files, so they have a fixed kind of quality about them, and you can't go too far with them before they start to pixelate. I think they're often the preferred format for things on websites, maybe. I don't tend to see them that much these days, but there are certain things that I think are still bitmap files, and I think they can do transparency potentially. Because they're often, you know, buttons and things on websites often.
So if you've got an image that's bitmap, because is it better to convert it to a JPEG or a TIFF?
I don't know that it's better necessarily. If it works perfectly well for you as a bitmap, there's probably no obligation to change it. The next thing I was going to talk about was the usability of these different file formats, because on the assumption that a lot of you use Word day to day, it has some really severe limitations on what kind of image files it will play with. So it won't allow you to insert either of these formats, which is why I think that's probably one of the prime reasons why a lot of graphic designers don't really deal with Word, because it severely limits what you can do with logos and any of those quite intricate kind of things. But it will generally be happy with certainly JPEGs and PNGs. I'm not sure about TIFFs. There is, it's a bit of a sideline. If you have one of these sorts of file formats that you need to insert in a Word document, there are a couple of other formats that Word will play with, which are SVG and EMF, which is an enhanced meta file. What those file formats offer is that they have this vector capability, so you can scale things quite a bit. But they're not very common file formats, and you wouldn't use them for photos, you would only use them for logos and line art. Any questions about those? No? Okay, good. The next thing I wanted to talk about was colour profiles, because this is something that will also come up in your use of photos. There are three main systems that you'll encounter. So and what they, these two at least, indicate is the how the images are composed, and what colours make up that image. So CMYK is images that are made up of 4 different colours, cyan, magenta, yellow and black. It's generally used for printing, particularly, definitely offset, usually digital as well. Digital printing can work with an RGB file, the second type we're going to look at, but often it's a bit easier to do a CMYK file if you have that capability. The second type there, RGB, is what you see on screen every day. So your computer monitor is an RGB screen, so it makes up every colour from red, green and blue. The third one there is Pantone. Has anyone heard of Pantone before? So Pantone, or often you'll hear PMS, which I think is Pantone matching system maybe. So PMS is a commercial way of specifying a very particular colour. So the Cadbury purple is a typical example. Cadbury trademarked that particular shade of purple as their PMS colour. Generally, if you have some kind of brand toolkit or something like that that has been set up for you by a designer, they will probably have specified for you specific PMS colours they want you to use. So, for example, the Law Foundation has this yellow is one PMS, the red on the banner there is a different PMS, and I think the grey is a PMS as well. And the way they work, instead of being composed of different colours, they are one fixed colour. So when it comes to the printing press, most of the stuff will be made up of 4 different types of ink, but that will be made up of an ink that is just that colour. So that's why designers and brand people like them, because they have a reliability about them, whereas these are all a formula, a composition, you know, essentially someone whipping up the colours and then putting them on a printing press, whereas that one is a fixed colour, it is that colour. I thought it would be useful to have a look at the different gamuts of the colours. So what we're talking about here is that the outside circle is the visible colour gamut, what you can see with your eyes. The yellow, kind of, what is that, a quadrilateral or something, is the RGB colour gamut, so that's what you can see on screen. The red one is the Pantone colour gamut, so it's pretty close to RGB. And the small one in the middle there is the CMYK colour gamut. The reason I show you this is because if you are converting your photos from RGB to CMYK, they often become they look much duller, they might look much flatter. And it's because the CMYK formula can't reproduce all the colours that RGB can. So when you're looking at, say you're preparing a document on screen, sometimes when you get back from the printer, you'll be a bit surprised that the images don't look as vibrant or as lively as they did on screen. And it's often because of this effect where the actual physical process, the physical CMYK process, cannot reproduce the wide range of colours that are visible on screen.
So do you need to convert your images into CMYK or something? How do you deal with that problem?
Yep. So it depends a bit what you're doing with them. If you're working with images that live exclusively online, I probably wouldn't bother converting them because it won't make any practical difference. And in fact, the RGB will probably look a bit more vibrant and a bit livelier. If you're producing something to be printed in hard copy on a digital printer, that's kind of optional. You can convert them if you want, but if you don't, the printer will convert them for you. If you're producing something to be printed on an offset press, like a publication with a large print run or some postcards or something, you or a designer or your pre-press people at the printer will probably want to convert them to, or will have to convert them to CMYK because the technology requires it.
Okay. So but once you've shot the photo, there's no way of going back in time and shooting it with a different colour?
So your camera will use its own settings. So this is more a kind of image processing thing. So it won't impact on the actual taking of the photo. In fact, there's a step before this where they talk about raw files, which are the version of the photo that the camera takes, and that raw file, you can do a heap of stuff with it around changing the exposure, changing the light levels, and that's where photographers do their editing. They probably don't do it at the CMYK RGB level. So, yeah, this stuff shouldn't affect your photo taking necessarily. It should only affect your preparation for print if you're getting something printed. So, I had one more slide on this kind of topic for you to talk about the different sorts of printing specs that you might encounter or be asked about. Do any of you do offset printing, or is it mostly digital printing that you do these days? Yeah.
We do offset.
Okay, great. So, when you draw up your printing specs, or when your printer kind of recommends something to you, they'll probably tell you it's 1 colour, 2 colour, 4 colour, or 5 colour. And those things indicate the different sorts of inks they'll use to produce your job. Digital printers will talk a bit about this stuff, but it's really not so relevant for digital printing. It's kind of a hangover from the offset days. But I'll talk through each of the different options. When you get a 1 colour job, the printing is done with 1 PMS colour. By default, that's probably black, but you might pick a brand colour or something like that. So for example, business cards are often done 1 colour, or they might be 2 colour, where you have black and your brand colour. In these two options, you specify, excuse me, from that, the Pantone colours, you specify the specific shades you want, and they will reproduce them for you. A good printer will reproduce them very accurately because the ink is the colour you've chosen. When we get up to 4 colour, which is probably the most common for offset printing, 4 colour is using cyan, magenta, yellow and black. And the printer uses those 4 inks to reproduce all of the colours you need. Where there's variation is that it's that's a formula. So the document runs through the printer 4 times. So the first layer it gets its yellow dots, the next layer it gets its cyan dots, then its magenta dots, and its black dots. It may not go in that order, but you get the picture. And the way those dots land on the page produce the different sorts of colours that you end up seeing in the printed job. One of the other options is 5 colour. So that's where they give you the cyan, magenta, yellow and black and a PMS colour. So if I'm thinking about this publication, the yellow here is a yellow PMS, and we did that because it appears in big blocks of colour, and you get a more even finish with a PMS colour where you've got blocks like that. All of the other colours in here are produced from CMYK. So this one was a 5-colour job at the printer. The printer, I mean, I'm telling you this stuff, but the printer will be able to guide you on it because they deal with it every day. But it helps to know, the different sorts of specifications. How important is it for you to have this specific yellow? Would a CMYK equivalent of that colour be good enough for you? The reason that we chose the PMS for this one is because there's a series of publications that all use this colour and they all have to sit side by side. If we did the CMYK, there would be the chance of variation between those different print jobs based on specifications from different printers, how clean the printer was, how long it dried for, how much ink they put on the page, a whole range of variables. Using a PMS colour can reduce some of those variables. So if colour matching is very important, PMS might be the way to go. If it's not quite so important, CMYK may be a cheaper option.
We've only got corporate colours in DPI. Can you specify printers within this DPI? Not DPI, sorry, the RGB I mean.
Yep, so you can, there are equivalents, but the equivalents are a bit rough. And I say that because of the difference in the colour gamuts.
Yeah.
So say your 3 colours are right on the edge of the CMYK blue shape there. You might get a bit of variation once you convert them to an RGB colour. Sorry, vice versa. If your colours are RGB and they're in the yellow space, some of those colours don't exist in CMYK. So there'll be a little bit of variation. But generally, a designer, when they set up your brand kit for you, if they're specifying brand colours, they will give you the CMYK, the RGB, and possibly a Pantone equivalent. And if they haven't done that, they can usually do it pretty easily. There is one other format, which I haven't really mentioned, but that you might come across if you're doing a lot of work on websites, and that's the hexadecimal colour system. Hexadecimal to me is a little bit of black magic because I don't really know how it works. Basically, all of the colours have a 6-digit code, hence hex, that give you the composition of that colour. So websites often use that to specify the different shades you see on them. Once again, there's usually an RGB equivalent of every hexadecimal colour and vice versa. And you'll find that if you search online, there are heaps of conversion tools where you type in your RGB colour and it will tell you the other codes, the hexadecimal code and the CMYK code to match that colour or close enough. So that's colours. I was going to move on from colours. Do you have any questions before I did? All right. I thought we might just run through the basics of page setup because there are some differences between how Word does it and between the file that the printer might want to receive from you if you're doing printed publications. So this is a sort of basic page layout. You have your clear text. If you can imagine this as a spread in a publication. So you have your clear text area, which is the blue dotted line. In the middle there you have what's called the gutter, so that's the space on either side of where the page is bound. On the outside of the page you have the margin, and then beyond the margin you have a space that's called the bleed, and the bleed is 3 to 5 mils typically beyond the outside of your page. Because Microsoft Word is not a publishing program, it doesn't allow you to create bleed by default. To execute that, you need to do some complex maths, changing the size of the page and letting your printer know how much you have changed the size so they know what to cut off. But if you are working with any kind of layout software, it will accommodate bleed for you. And the point of bleed is that where you have something like this, where the image bleeds off the page, the way the printer cuts the edge of the page is not super precise. It's done on a machine, basically. So you need to have enough of the image going beyond the page that when they trim it, you're not going to get a white border around the edge of the page. So that's why they usually specify 3 to 5 mils of bleed, because that gives their machine just a little bit of variation to make sure that you don't get that white border where the image finishes. So the options are, if you are working, say you're producing a publication in Word that is going to be printed, you probably want to steer away from having images that bleed off the edge of the page, because it will be technically quite difficult for you to set that up. If you you probably want to stick within the margins of the page, so that you don't need to accommodate that extra 3 to 5 mils. If your brand is to have things bleeding off the edge of the page, what it means is that you need to adjust your default page size to add 3 to 5 mils to the outside of the page, and then you need to tell the printer what you've done, because you then are no longer working with a standard A4 page, you're working with an A4 page with a bit of extra space around the edge. It's quite complex, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, is the truth. I'm going to talk about a few layout tools that will let you do this easily online. So we will move on to that. Grids is another layout principle that designers use, and it will help you to, have professional-looking publications. The way a grid works is that the document is divided up into set spaces. So this one here is an example of a 5-column grid. With a 5-column grid, you could look at something like this, where you have your 2 text columns, a wide margin that you could use for captions or footnotes or any kind of explanatory detail. To give the layout a little bit of texture, you could flow a pull quote or something out into the margin, or you could have your images pushing out. The other way that a grid works is that, in this example, this is a 7-column grid. So you've got a blank column on the outside, and then 3 columns of text that are 2 columns wide each. So this is a way that designers try to keep things even and give themselves some different layout options. Because this is the equivalent of 6 columns, you could in fact have 2 wide columns if you want, all within the same grid. So you notice that magazines and newspapers use this sort of technique to change up the layouts a bit with some sort of underlying architecture to help them control that. Once again, a tool like Word doesn't really do this natively, but it's a kind of, it's a thinking process that you can have in mind as you're designing things. The next thing I wanted to talk about was some case studies about infographics, because I think increasingly that's the way people are telling stories, and they can be a really fun thing to work with. So good infographics generally have something to say. They're trying to communicate something specific. They're usually easy to understand, or they ought to be, because if they're more complex than explaining it in text, you're probably not achieving the desired outcome. And they're accurate and honest. Sometimes when we try to distill complex information into something visual, there is the risk that we end up obscuring the truth of the matter. So I think it's always really important to think about what does the underlying information say, not what looks nice in this nifty little diagram that I've drawn. The kind of steps that you might want to take when you're thinking about developing an infographic. First of all, interrogate the data. Think about the information you've got, whether it's some survey results, whether it's some data that you want to place onto a map to show the distribution of something. Think about what your actual data shows. Is there a story in there, and what is that story? Think about the context. Where will the infographic appear? Will it be in print or will it be on screen? Because all of those things will guide perhaps the shape that you design, the colours that you use, the size of it, the size of the font on the thing, because you need to know how big it's going to end up. And the third step is to make sure that you choose the right tool for the job. So think about what the key message is. Is it going to be a map? Is it going to be a series of oversized numbers showing percentages? Is it going to be some sort of flow chart that maps a process? There's a whole range of different ways you can approach infographics, and have a think about what kind of tool is going to tell your story most effectively. There are some common design tools that you might consider. So the Microsoft Office Suite will be familiar to most of you. Its advantages are that it has a familiar interface and is easy to use. It's easy to access because some composition of those programs is usually available in the office. It has some decent presets, so I don't know if you've used any of the Smart Art tools. I think it's one of the toolbars at the top. And it will help you to visualise flowcharts, complex kind of arranges of text boxes that interrelate. It does a pretty decent job of setting up some really quick, effective infographics. And they're also highly shareable in that you can create something in one program and then usually copy it into the other programs that you might be working with within that suite. The downside of those sorts of tools is they have limited customization, so the default presets are often the ones that you'll be most familiar with because a lot of people use them without doing any kind of manipulation of them. Sometimes they can look a little bit basic. They don't give you a lot of fine control over the layout of things. But for something really quick, I think they're a great solution. When we think about professional design tools, if you work with a designer or a printer, these are probably the bits of software that they refer to. The Adobe Creative Suite, the three most well-known pieces of software in that suite are Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. They all have different kind of purposes. So Photoshop is mainly used for editing photos, retouching photos, some kind of general sorts of design work. Illustrator is used for those vector-based files I referred to easier, so it gives you fine detail control over lines and manipulation of textures, things like that. Useful for logos and diagrammatic type things. And the last one there is InDesign, which is used for layout type projects. So you might lay out a publication like this in InDesign or something like that. Handy for ads, those sorts of things. The advantages of this suite of tools is they're very powerful and they have a lot of functionality. There's a fairly common interface across the suite of tools, which makes it easy to jump from one to the next once you have mastered one. They too have decent presets. They'll spit out things that look pretty good, and they're quite shareable too. The downside is that they have a really steep learning curve. They're quite, they're professional level software, so learning to use them, if it's only an occasional thing, will feel like quite a daunting undertaking. But there are some great training courses around. The other downside of this software is that it's quite expensive. The license fees are quite expensive, particularly if you need to have multiple people being able to access the software. It can get quite costly quite quickly. And the other thing is that the starting point is often a blank canvas. They don't. It's not that easy to get the kind of preset formulas in there. They don't give you a lot of templates and things to work with. So you need to hunt that stuff down if you want it. I thought it would be useful to talk about some free and low-cost alternatives, because if you are not investing in this stuff, there are some other ways around it. So, the first of these, in fact all of these are websites, so there's Pictochart, Infogram and Canva. Most of them offer, you have to sign up for them to use them, and they will, the document you produce will live in the program until you export it. Most of them have some sort of membership fee if you want to export at a really high printable quality. So you can probably have a bit of a play in there before you have to invest some money in it. They have a great range of presets for developing infographics, so things like maps, charts, flowcharts, those sorts of things. They also have some really great presentation templates if you need to do like PowerPoint slides, those sorts of things. Yeah, they're really great tools, and they offer you a decent level of customization. There's some things that you won't necessarily be able to manipulate all the way to the endpoint that you might like, but you'll be able to go quite a long way with these sorts of tools. Yeah.
When you say they're sitting online, so you're working effectively in the cloud, is that what you're saying?
Yep. So you have an account on the website, and your file lives there until you export it.
So that could be issued to some agencies around?
Yeah, potentially. You would maybe need to investigate the where the server is based, I guess. Yeah, that's a really good point. You would need to check that it's going to fit in with your security requirements. Some other ones I wanted to mention. So these were, well, those ones are mainly for developing infographics in a kind of automated kind of way. These ones offer, I guess, more of that layout and design capability. So Scribus and LucidPress are alternatives to InDesign. So they'll let you lay out publications. They'll let you do some reasonably complex typography, and I think they do a pretty good job. I haven't worked in each of them a lot, but the work I have done in them was really easy to do. They're really easy user interface and great help notes as well to help you kind of get your head around the basics of it. So yeah, I think if you want to expand your skills in this area or try something new and you have time to do it, I think both of these can deliver a really good result, and they will let you do some things that Word necessarily prevents you from doing. So if you're looking to do some more complex designs, these might be a good way to work. The one in the middle there, Inkscape, is an alternative to Illustrator, so it will let you work with vector files if you need to do that. So say you've got a logo that's in colour and you need to do a white version of it, you should be able to upload your logo in here and change it, or fiddle with the transparency, or any of those sorts of things you might need to do. It will let you do that fine-tuning of those vector type files.
Is there a cost for those?
I think it's a little while since I've used them, but I think Scribus and LucidPress are free. I would have to check on Inkscape, but they're not expensive. They're not like InDesign type license fees. They're low-cost alternatives. I had a couple of examples of infographics. This one, the lines linking the things are probably a little bit pale for the screen, but you might be able to see it in your handout potentially. This was a project I had to work on where we were trying to map the process for people arriving in emergency departments and how they get triaged into different sorts of areas. So we looked here at the two sorts of the main ways that people present. So either they self-present or they come via ambulance. Once they get to the emergency department, they're either considered non-admitted or admitted. If they're non-admitted, they go into those three options and then eventually get discharged home. If they get admitted, they go into those other two areas, the ED cubicle and the examination area. And then from there, they'll either be discharged to a ward or discharged to a short stay ward. And the third path there in the middle is that they might get transferred to another hospital if the hospital they've presented to can't look after them. In text, this was about 1 or 1.5 pages worth of content. And we thought that there was a lot of detail in there that was perhaps not that relevant for the layperson's understanding of how emergency departments work. People probably just need a more surface level understanding. So we worked with the audit team to develop this pretty simple diagram for that process. But yeah, we were pretty happy that it did a good job of simplifying that into something kind of legible. The other element we added was to show the different stages down the bottom, so that in the text we could talk about the arrival stage, triage and registration, and discharge. And the fact that they're being assessed throughout that process by the emergency department staff. This one here was an infographic I developed for the Auditor General's office, and the purpose of this one was something to support their recruitment activities. They wanted to be able to sell the organisation to potential recruits. So in this one, we had a bit of information about the organisation, the type of work we do, because often an Auditor General's office is not that transparent. It's difficult to know what that kind of workplace does. We talked a bit about the coloured boxes there represent the different divisions within the organisation. We had recently relaunched the values, so we included those. And then the other two elements on that page were a compact map about the location of the office and some of the other benefits around health and wellbeing, the kind of things that the workplace offers. So this one was just a simple one-pager that lives on the recruitment section of the website for prospective applicants. This one here was an infographic I developed for a report about the TAFE sector. The top part there, it hasn't shown up very well on slides, but is actually a map of Victoria so that you can get a sense of where the TAFE institutes are located. And then we just used a combination of other graphic elements to show different aspects of the TAFE sector. So this one was a kind of sector overview. We had different sorts of numbers, so we tried a few different graph techniques to try and illustrate those as well. This one was a similar one, looking at how to present a sector overview of the Office's financial audit program. There wasn't a lot to work with. We had a 2-page spread but minimal content, so we looked at how to, I guess, pull out those key numbers and make it work as a spread within a publication. This was one about TAFE funding, so this one combined some different kind of flow lines with different funding sources and what buckets they ended up in. This one went through quite a few iterations because it was quite complex to pin it down. And even looking at it now, I'm not 100% confident that it's that legible, but it replaced about 2 pages worth of text trying to explain this model. Yeah, I think it does a decent job, but maybe it needed one more iteration before we got it to really sing. And this one here was one that I'm working on a publication for the Supreme Court at the moment, and they wanted to show the different setups of a civil courtroom versus a criminal courtroom. And they wanted to be able to, in some way, show the different people in the courtroom and where they sit. So some of the models that they had looked at previously were a kind of aerial, almost like a floor plan of the courtroom, but it didn't really give a sense of the three-dimensionality of it. They had other ones where it was a photo of a courtroom with some labels sitting over it, but they were often quite complex because courtrooms, often have a lot of timber work and logos and things like that, and it was, they weren't that legible once you had labels overlaying the different people in the courtroom. So the solution we came up with was this kind of 2D but slightly 3D looking diagram that tries to differentiate the two different sorts of courtroom. They live together on one page in the publication, so we used colours to try and differentiate the different schemes so they didn't look like an identical thing. So yeah, that one is in progress. This was an example of a publication where it was largely text-based, but we wanted to try and inject a little bit of visual appeal to it. So we looked at using logos to open each section, and then we also incorporated the little light bulb icon into the hint boxes around the place. So there were some fairly simple techniques, but hopefully to give it a little bit of colour rather than just being a text-based publication. And once again, this one, I'm sorry, it hasn't shown up very well. There's a map of Australia underneath those 3 dots, and that was just an example of how to develop a really simple infographic to illustrate the key numbers in a piece of text. That's about it from me today. Thanks for your time and attention. I hope it was a useful session. Did you have any remaining questions? Yeah.
I'm involved with the luxury fashion, number one. Number two is, my rule of thumb, I want your comment, is left to right, top to bottom. Because you address yourself to a reader, often business to business, and sometimes the public. What do you think of that idea? Top to bottom,
I think
left
it's,
to right?
Look, I think it's a
logical
fine,
flow?
I think it is an entirely logical flow. I think if it is applied rigorously over a long document, you might find that it gets a little bit stale potentially, and you might want to mix it up. Sometimes I think capturing the reader's attention, perhaps through a different kind of flow, might help one piece of information stand out from the rest. But I think it's a good starting point. I think that's how people read. So.
And our second problem, we deal with people, the mother tongue is not English.
Yep.
But you make it simple.
Yep.
And to make them to understand it.
Yep.
Remember it. And regurgitate to someone else.
Yep.
This is our problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think things like numbered lists can help people navigate processes quite easily. But yeah, there are certainly challenges where, English might not be the reader's first language. So.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I thought it was useful.
Thank you.
I have a question. Sorry, a bit late. Why have you got the moon?
Because we've achieved our...
Oh, I see. We've reached the moon. Sorry, did I miss the rocket ship at the beginning?
No, there is an astronaut in that same image set, but I didn't use it.
The images have been gorgeous, and as has the presentation. So thank you very much indeed, Peter. Infographics, as we know, are a really key development in terms of our communication, clear and concise around systems and processes that are obviously sometimes really difficult and lengthy to get through to people. So I love that bit too. Thank you again for your time and expertise, and I hope you have picked up some useful tips and tricks for your communications. Thank you again for coming, and come again soon. Cheers.
Thank you.